The oldest ocean floor on Earth is less than 200 million years old. Pangea, the supercontinent that once held all land in a single continuous mass, began breaking apart at roughly that same threshold. And everything that existed on the surfaces now lying beneath those oceans has been recycled completely. Not buried, not waiting. Unmade by the planet's own slow heat. Scientists call this subduction the process by which one tectonic plate slides beneath another, dragging the crust downward until pressure and temperature dissolve it back into the mantle. If anything was built on those older surfaces, anything at all, it did not simply disappear. It was returned. Tonight we follow the question that moment leaves behind. What if the first civilization disappeared, not in catastrophe, not in fire, but in the slow geological way that Pangea itself disappeared, pulled apart by the forces too gradual for any single lifetime to witness, until the land that once held everything in common became the separate continents we now think of as permanent. We will move through 3 traces. The first runs through stone, through what the geological record preserves and what it reliably actively erases. The second runs through behaviour, through what a civilization might look like if its most important achievements were never built at all, but carried in practice and memory, across a world too vast and too restless to reward monuments. The third runs through myth, through why certain shapes of loss keep surfacing in cultures that never met long after the landscapes that first caused them had vanished entirely. We will not resolve this tonight. That is not what this space is for. The question is not a small one to hold. It asks us to consider whether the absence of evidence is itself a form of evidence and to sit quietly with the discomfort of not knowing which. Here is what we do know. The geological record from the Pangean era is not empty. We have fossils, we have chemical signatures, we have rock formations that survived the breakup in fragments carried now on separate continents, matched only by their composition and their age. What we do not have, what we could not have given. The processes involved is any surface from that period that was not subducted, eroded, metamorphosed, or buried beneath the kilometers of later material. The archive exists. It has simply been edited by forces indifferent to what it might have held. Consider this: the planet has experienced 5 mass extinction events that we can identify with confidence. The one most people know, the one that ended the non-avian dinosaurs, occurred roughly 66 million years ago. Pangea was already fragmenting by then, its separation tens of millions of years underway. But there is an earlier event at the boundary between the Permian and Triassic periods, approximately 252 million years ago, that eliminated an estimated 96% of all marine species and 70% of terrestrial vertebrates. It is the largest die-off in the planet's known history, and it occurred at the edge of the Pangean world at the moment the supercontinent was most unified, and just beginning to tear. Some researchers argue the Siberian Traps, one of the most extensive volcanic events ever recorded, triggered it. That argument carries weight and the geological evidence supports it strongly. But the timing sits in the record as a shape without full explanation, the most complete world that ever existed, ending at the threshold of its own unravelling. Whether anything else were lost alongside the species we can name and count the record does not say. We will not answer that tonight. We are only noting the pattern. What makes this question worth following is not the possibility of ruins. Ruins are a specific kind of expectation, one shaped by our own brief history, our own tendency to build in stone, to leave permanent marks, to assume that what matters must announce itself in forms that outlast the hand that made them. A civilization adapted to Pangea would not necessarily share those assumptions. A world without continental barriers, without the moderating influence of distant oceans on its deep interior, without the stable coastlines we use as natural anchors for settlement, such a world would reward different instincts. Flexibility over permanence, movement over accumulation, memory over monument. The deep interior of Pangea would have been extraordinary in its extreme summers that built heat for weeks without relief, winters that settled into the stone and held. Not an environment that invited large fixed structures in its harshest zones. A world that rewarded knowing when to move and where and why. If intelligence arose there, and we are not claiming that it did, it would have been shaped by those pressures as surely as any living thing is shaped by the world it must navigate. It would not look like what we mean when we say the word civilization. It might look instead like a highly refined relationship with impermanence. a way of knowing the world that left almost nothing behind by design and even less by time. This is where the three traces begin to matter. Not as proof of anything, as a patient examination of what the geological record can and cannot hold, and what disappears in the space between those two things. The planet has been breaking and reforming for 4.5 billion years. What we are living on right now, this apparently solid, apparently stable ground, is a temporary arrangement of plates that will look entirely different in another 100 million years. The Atlantic is still widening. The Himalayas are still rising. Nothing here is finished. That impermanence is not frightening exactly. It is simply the condition of the place. And it is worth holding quietly as we ask what kinds of things can survive inside it, and what kinds of things, no matter how real, no matter how significant, are simply returned without record. So we follow the first trace now into Sohn and into what Pangea's dissolution preserves about the question of what might have been lost when the world learned slowly and without ceremony how to come apart, the shape of a world that no longer exists. To understand what Pangea was, it helps to set aside the diagram. The textbook image, those familiar continental outlines pressed together, like puzzle pieces labelled and colour-coded, and frozen in pedagogical stillness, gives the impression of a fact already settled, already resolved. Pangea is a concept to be memorised and moved past. But Pangea is a place as a living system of climate and terrain and biological pressure operating across 100 million years was something else entirely. It was the longest continuous land surface the Earth has produced in the last 500 million years, and for a significant portion of that span, it was the only surface there was one unbroken world ringed by a single global ocean holding everything that lived on land within its borders, without ever drawing a border at all. Stand for a moment in what would now be the deep interior of that mass. Not at its edges where shallow seas lapped at low coastal plains and the air carried salt and moisture inward across broad deltas, but in the true interior, the region that corresponds today very roughly to where Central Asia meets the ancient heart of what is now the Middle East, thousands of kilometres from any coast in any direction. The air here would be dry in a way that has no modern equivalent on the same scale. Seasons would not moderate. Summer would build heat for weeks without the relief that distant ocean surfaces provide, accumulating in the stone and the soil, until the landscape itself became a radiator. Winter would arrive without softening, settling into the ground like something structural rather than merely seasonal. The sky above would be vast and largely cloudless for months at a time, and rain when it came would come in brief violence, convective storms that broke suddenly and then withdrew, leaving the cracked earth steaming, and within days dry again. This is not speculation dressed as a description. It follows directly from what climatologists call continentality, the principle that land masses, unlike oceans, cannot store and redistribute heat with any efficiency, and that the larger the landmass, the more extreme its interior becomes as a consequence. Modern Central Asia already demonstrates the principle on a regional scale. Temperatures in parts of Siberia and the Kazakh steppe swing more than 60 degrees Celsius between summer peak and winter floor. Pangea's interior would have operated on a scale that makes those modern extremes appear moderate by comparison. The word extreme applied honestly to that climate does not quite reach the reality it is trying to name, and yet life was there and it was not simple. The fossil record from the Permian period, the last extended chapter of Pangea's intact existence, shows a biosphere of unexpected complexity. Therapsids, the mammal-like reptiles whose lineage would eventually produce every mammal alive today, were among the dominant land vertebrates. Some were large, some appear from skeletal evidence to have lived in social groupings. Some show bone growth patterns that paleontologists interpret as a metabolic signature distinct from the baseline cold-blooded physiology of earlier reptilian lineages, suggesting tentatively that the boundary between reptile and something metabolically closer to a mammal was already beginning to blur in the Permian world. The land that would become Pangea's fossil record was not a simple or primitive place. It was layered with ecological relationships that had taken hundreds of millions of years to develop. What ended that world abruptly by the geological standards was the Permian-Triassic extinction event approximately 252 million years ago. 96% of marine species, 70% of terrestrial vertebrates, the largest die-off the planet has recorded in the half-billion years for which we have a reasonably detailed fossil archive. The most widely supported cause remains the Siberian traps, a volcanic province that released lava across roughly 2 million square kilometers of what is now northern Russia over a period of perhaps 1 million years, which in geological time registers as something close to instantaneous. The gases accompanying those eruptions altered atmospheric chemistry, acidified the oceans, and destabilized the interlocking climate systems that the Permian biosphere had spent epochs calibrating itself against. What the extinction record also shows, and what is worth holding carefully as we carry this evening's question forward, is that Pangea itself survived. The supercontinent did not break apart because the Permian Triassic event destroyed it. It continued reorganizing its biosphere around the survivors for another 50 million years, after the worst die-off in Earth's known history. That means the long Pangean era, the era that forms the temporal setting for any serious consideration of early complex life on a unified world, was not concluded by catastrophe. It was dissolved. Over tens of millions of years, the same deep heat engine in the mantle that had assembled the supercontinent began with the same geological patience to pull it apart again. And that distinction carries more weight than it might initially seem, because catastrophe leaves wreckage, and dissolution leaves nothing recognizable at all. The breakup of Pangea was not a single event with a date we could name. It was a sequence of separations drawn across an enormous span of time. The first major rift opened what would become the Central Atlantic beginning roughly 200 million years ago. The separation of South America from Africa continued for tens of millions of years after that. Antarctica did not fully detach from Australia until approximately 50 million years before the present. These timelines mean that the Pangean world ended over a period longer than the entirety of mammalian evolutionary history, longer by a significant factor than the time between us and the extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs. For anything living through any portion of that dissolution, the land would have felt essentially permanent. Rivers would still run, forests would persist across generations and across centuries. The fact that the world was quietly coming apart at scales visible only from geological orbit would have been entirely inaccessible, not concealed, but simply unperceivable by any biology that has ever existed. This is the landscape in which we carry our central question. Not a world ending in fire or impact or a single season of catastrophe, but a world changing so slowly, so continuously, and so thoroughly that by the time the change was complete, no surface from the world that preceded it remained intact above ground anywhere on Earth. The geological record from this era speaks, but it speaks in the compressed and altered language of deep time, in rock that has been folded, heated, eroded, and reassembled into forms that preserve consequence without preserving context. And learning to read that language to distinguish what it genuinely holds from what it has long since returned to the mantle is where the first trace properly begins. Trace we. What stone keeps and what it returns. Zircon is a mineral so resistant to alteration that geologists have used individual crystals of it to reconstruct conditions on Earth's surface. More than 4 billion years ago, more than 1 billion years before complex life existed in any form. A single grain of zircon, no larger than a grain of sand, can survive the metamorphic pressures that transform surrounding rock into something entirely unrecognizable, preserving within its crystal lattice isotopic ratios that record the temperature and chemistry of the environment in which it originally formed. Zircon does not lie. It does not rewrite itself under pressure the way most minerals do. It simply holds with extraordinary fidelity a chemical memory of the moment it crystallined. That a mineral this small and this durable can carry information across 4 billion years is not a minor footnote in geology. It is the clearest demonstration available that the Earth is capable of preserving the past when the conditions are specific enough, when the material is resistant enough, and when the subsequent geological history happens by chance to leave that material undisturbed. The reason this matters for the question we are carrying is precisely what it implies about everything else. If zircon can survive 4 billion years, and if the conditions for that survival are as narrow and specific as the geological record shows them to be, then the absence of comparable preservation for larger, more complex structures is not an accident of discovery. It is a consequence of physics. Stone in most of its forms does not behave like zircon. Limestone dissolves in mildly acidic groundwater. Sandstone erodes along grain boundaries under the mechanical pressure of water and wind. Basalt weathers into clay minerals within geologically short timescales when exposed to surface conditions. Even granite, the material most people think of when they imagine geological permanence, fractures, exfoliates, and breaks down into sand over timescales measured in tens of millions of years. What survives in the deep record does so not because stone is durable in any general sense, but because the specific minerals in specific chemical environments happen to avoid the particular processes most efficient at destroying them. Preservation in deep time is not the default state. It is the exception, and a narrow one. The surfaces of Pangea present a specific problem that goes beyond an ordinary erosion. When a tectonic plate carrying continental crust moves toward a subduction zone, a boundary where one plate descends beneath another into the mantle, the material at the leading edge of the continental plate is not simply buried. It's drawn downward into an environment where temperatures exceed several hundred degrees Celsius and pressures reach levels sufficient to recrystallize rock into entirely new mineral assemblages. Granite becomes eclogite, limestone becomes marble, sandstone becomes quartzite. In each case, the original texture, the layering, the grain, boundaries, the chemical gradients that might have recorded surface conditions is overwritten by the new pressure-temperature regime. The rock that emerges, if it eventually returns to the surface through tectonic uplift, carries information about the conditions deep in the subduction zone. It carries almost nothing readable about the surface from which it came. Whatever was there before the descent is not hidden within the metamorphosed rock. It has been chemically erased and structurally replaced. The oceanic crust presents an even starker version of this problem. Unlike continental crust, which is too buoyant to subduct completely and therefore accumulates at the surface over geological time, oceanic crust is continuously created at mid-ocean ridges and continuously consumed at subduction zones. The cycle is complete and it is relentless. The oldest oceanic crust on Earth today, measured not by the age of the continents it borders, but by the age of the seafloor itself, is found in small patches of the western Pacific and reaches back approximately 200 million years. Everything older is gone, not buried, not waiting to be drilled and sampled. Gone, returned to the mantle, its surface history erased as thoroughly as if it had never formed. The floor of what was once the Thalassic Ocean, the single vast ocean that surrounded Pangea during its intact existence, does not exist anywhere on Earth. It has been completely recycled. Whatever was deposited on that seafloor, whatever settled to the bottom of those ancient waters over the 100 million years of Pangea's stability is inaccessible, not because we lack the technology to reach it, but because the planet has already processed it back into undifferentiated mantle material. The Central Atlantic magmatic province sharpens this picture further. As Pangea began its initial rifting approximately 200 million years ago, the stretching crust allowed magma to reach the surface across an area estimated at more than 11 million square kilometers larger than the entire continent of Europe. The lava flows associated with this event, which geologists classify among the largest igneous provinces in Earth's history, would have buried any surface features across that entire region beneath layers of basalt potentially hundreds of meters thick. Not covered in the way sediment covers things and leaves them potentially recoverable. Buried under molten rock that cooled into a uniform featureless surface, erasing the topography, the soil, the sedimentary record, and anything built or shaped or deposited on the landscape underneath. The geological signature of this event is still visible today in matching basalt formations found on the separated coastlines of North America, Africa, and Europe, a shared scar from the moment the Atlantic began to open. What it does not preserve is any record of the surface that preceded it. This is the first trace, and it does not point toward a lost civilization. It points toward the conditions that would make one undetectable. The geological record from the Pangean era is not empty because nothing happened. It is selectively preserved according to principles that have no interest in surface complexity, no mechanism for distinguishing intentional modification from natural processes, and no capacity to retain the kinds of materials that intelligence in any form we can currently imagine would most likely use. What the stone keeps is chemistry and pressure and time. What it returns without ceremony or record is everything else. And it is from within that asymmetry between what the Earth holds and what it releases that the second trace opens, asking not what the geological record preserves, but what a civilization might look like if it had been designed by necessity rather than by choice to leave the stone undisturbed entirely. Trace 2, the civilization that built nothing permanent. Among the Yolngu people of northern Australia, navigational knowledge of the coastline and the seasonal movements of fish, wind and water has been transmitted orally across generations for a period that some researchers estimate extends back more than 10,000 years to a time when the coastline itself looked fundamentally different, when sea levels were lower and the land reached further into what is now the Timor Sea. The knowledge did not survive because it was carved into stone or pressed into clay. It survived because it was embedded in song and ceremonial practice, in the precise sequencing of names and landmarks that functioned simultaneously as geography, calendar and cosmology. When the coastline changed slowly across centuries of post-glacial sea level rise, the knowledge adapted with it, incorporating new features without losing the structural framework that made it transmissible. What this demonstrates at a minimum is that complex, accurate, spatially sophisticated knowledge can survive for timescales that dwarf the entirety of written history without producing a single artifact that archaeology would recognize as evidence of its existence. This is where the second trace begins, not in stone, but in the logic of what survives when stone is not the medium. The assumption underlying most discussions of ancient civilization is that complexity requires externalization, that knowledge to be reliable and transmissible across generations must be written down, inscribed, built into structures whose physical persistence does the work that human memory cannot. This assumption is reasonable within the context of our own civilization, which is so large, so specialized, and so dependent on coordinating the activities of billions of individuals that no oral tradition could possibly carry its operational requirements. But it is not a universal truth about intelligence. It is a description of one particular solution to a particular set of coordination problems arrived at under particular historical circumstances. Other solutions exist, and some of them are far older and far more durable than anything written language has yet produced. The anthropological literature on non-literate knowledge systems is extensive enough and consistent enough in its findings to support a principle that is worth stating. Plainly, the absence of written records does not indicate the absence of complex knowledge. Hunter-gatherer societies studied in the 20th century carried detailed pharmacological knowledge of hundreds of plant species, astronomical calendars accurate enough to predict solstices and equinoxes, ecological management practices that maintained landscape productivity across centuries and legal and ethical frameworks, sophisticated enough to resolve disputes, manage resource allocation, and regulate behavior across large social networks, none of which required or produced any durable physical artifact beyond the people carrying it. The knowledge was real. It was effective. It was in many cases more finely calibrated to its specific environment than anything an external observer equipped only with material evidence could have inferred. And it was in the absence of the people who held it entirely invisible. Now extend that principle across a timescale not of centuries but of millions of years, and across a landscape not of one continent but of a single unified whirl. A civilization shaped by Pangea's conditions, by the deep interior's extremes, by the slow instability of a world that rewarded movement over settlement, flexibility over accumulation, might have developed knowledge systems of extraordinary sophistication without ever producing the material signatures that geology can preserve. Its infrastructure would be social rather than physical networks of relationship, obligation, and information exchange that spanned thousands of kilometers, not through roads and way stations, but through the accumulated practice of generation, who knew which routes were passable in which seasons, which regions held water in which years, which ecological signals indicated conditions 200 kilometers away. The world would be legible to such a civilization in ways that leave no trace in rock, because the legibility was encoded in people rather than in landscape. The Permian fauna offers a suggestive, if indirect, point of contact with this idea. The Therapsids, the mammal-like reptiles dominant in the late Pangean world, include lineages that show skeletal evidence of parental care, of social grouping, and in some cases of relatively extended developmental periods during which young animals would have been dependent on adults. Extended developmental dependence is one of the key biological preconditions for cumulative cultural learning. The longer a young animal remains in close contact with experienced adults, the more behavioral information it can acquire through observation and practice rather than through instinct alone. This does not establish that any Permian therapsid was intelligent in a meaningful sense. The neurological evidence simply does not exist to support such a claim, and the skeletal record is too fragmentary to permit strong inferences about cognitive capacity, but it does establish that the biological architecture from which cumulative cultural learning emerges was present in the Pangean world, that the preconditions were not absent even if their fulfillment remains entirely undemonstrated. What the second trace is really asking is a question about the relationship between intelligence and visibility. Our civilization is extraordinarily visible to satellites, to future geologists, to any intelligence that might examine this planet in 100 million years and find our plastics and our nitrogen signatures and our urban heat islands preserved in the sedimentary record. That visibility is a consequence of specific choices to extract a build permanently to modify the landscape at scales that outlast any individual project. But visibility is not a property of intelligence itself. It is a property of a particular kind of intelligence operating under a particular kind of pressure. A civilization that did not face the coordination problems requiring externalized knowledge that remained small enough, mobile enough, and ecologically integrated enough that its knowledge could live in its people rather than its infrastructure would not be visible. Not because it was hiding, but because visibility was never the strategy it needed. The detail that lingers from this trace, and that no purely geological argument can dissolve, is simply this. The cognitive and social prerequisites for civilization as a functional system, cumulative learning, knowledge transmission across generations, ecological management, long-distance coordination do not require stone, do not require writing, and do not require any of the materials that deep time is capable of preserving. They require only time stability and biological architecture complex enough to support them. All three of those conditions existed in the Pangean world. Whether they produced anything is a question the second trace cannot answer. What it can establish is that the absence of physical evidence and the absence of civilization are not in fact the same absence. And it is precisely that gap between what we can detect and what might have existed that the third trace moves directly into, from a direction that neither geology nor anthropology fully anticipated. Trace 3. What the myths kept without knowing joy. Why? Ask a folklorist to map the global distribution of flood narratives, and the resulting picture is one of the most geographically consistent patterns in the entire comparative study of human mythology. Flood myths, stories in which a world-ending inundation destroys a previous civilization or a previous state of the world, leaving behind only a remnant from which the present order descends, appear in the oral and written traditions of Mesopotamia, ancient India, pre-Columbian to Mesoamerica, coastal West Africa, indigenous Australia, the Pacific Islands, ancient Greece, and dozens of other cultures across every inhabited continent. They do not share the same names, the same gods, the same moral frameworks, or the same specific details, but they share a structure, a world that was all water that came a catastrophic severance between what existed before and what was permitted to exist after. The convergence is striking enough that it has generated serious academic debate for more than a century, and has not, despite sustained effort from multiple disciplines, been fully explained by any single mechanism. The standard explanation, and it is a reasonable one worth taking seriously, is that flood myths arise independently wherever human populations live near water. Because floods are among the most universally experienced and psychologically overwhelming natural disasters available to human memory. A coastal community flooded by storm surge, a river valley inundated by seasonal overflow. A low-lying settlement destroyed by a tsunami-genic earthquake. All of these produce traumatic communal memories that, filtered through generations of oral transmission, naturally crystallize into narratives of world-ending water. Under this explanation, the convergence of flood myths across cultures reflects not a shared historical event, but a shared human vulnerability, the same experience recurring in different places and generating the same narrative response. This is a coherent argument. It accounts for a great deal, and it becomes complicated, not refuted but complicated, when the specificity of certain flood traditions is examined more carefully. In 2010, two researchers at the University of Melbourne, Patrick Nunn and Nicholas Reed, published an analysis of Aboriginal Australian oral traditions describing landscapes now submerged beneath the sea. The traditions, drawn from dozens of distinct language groups across the continent, groups with no known historical contact with one another, describe specific coastal features including islands, headlands and river mouths that geologists could confirm had existed before post-glacial sea level. Rise submerged them in some cases more than 10,000 years ago. The accuracy of the geographic detail was sufficient that the traditions could be cross-referenced against bathymetric maps of the current seafloor and matched to submerged topographic features with reasonable precision. What this demonstrated was not that Aboriginal Australians had written records or any form of externalised geographic archive. It demonstrated that oral traditions maintained with sufficient cultural fidelity and embedded in ceremonial frameworks that discouraged casual alteration could preserve accurate geographic information across timescales that most Western scholars had assumed were simply beyond the reach of human memory. 10,000 years without a single written word. This is where the third trace begins to complicate the picture in ways that neither geology nor anthropology alone can fully contain. If oral traditions can preserve accurate information about physical geography across 10,000 years, the natural question is what the upper limit of that preservation capacity might be, and whether the structure of certain mythological traditions might encode in forms too altered to be directly decoded, memories that are older than the post-glacial coastlines of Australia. The question cannot be answered with confidence. The chain of transmission required to bridge the gap between 10,000 years and 200 million is so vastly longer that any serious comparison risks becoming absurd. But the question itself is not absurd. It is a legitimate inquiry into the relationship between the timescales of geological change and the timescales across which culturally embedded memory has been demonstrated to operate. The specific mythological motif that sits most uncomfortably in this context is not the flood itself, but what precedes it, the memory of a world that was once unified and is no longer. In traditions as geographically separated as the Hopi accounts of previous worlds destroyed and replaced the Polynesian narratives of a sunken homeland called Hawaii. The Platonic account of Atlantis as a continent swallowed by the sea, and certain Vedic cosmological frameworks describing yugas as successive ages of increasing fragmentation and loss. There is a structural insistence on the idea that the present world is not the original world, that something more complete, more connected, and more intact preceded it, and that the transition between then and now involved not just catastrophe but severance, not simply destruction, but the loss of a form of connectedness that cannot be recovered. The emotional texture of these traditions is not triumph over disaster. It's a mourning for a completeness that no longer exists. It would be methodologically irresponsible to read that emotional texture as a literal memory of Pangea. The timescales are incompatible with any continuous chain of oral transmission, and the structural similarity between myths of lost unity and the actual geological history of continental fragmentation could easily be coincidental, a product of the universal human experience of loss, and the universal tendency to project that experience backward onto a mythologized past. These are genuine and important objections, and they do not disappear simply because the pattern is striking. What they cannot do, however, is explain away the pattern entirely. They cannot account for why such myths might arise independently. They cannot account for why the specific emotional and structural content, the unified world, the severance, the mourning for lost connection appears so consistently across traditions that demonstrably had no contact with one another. Coincidence is an explanation. It is not always a satisfying one. The third trace, then, is the most uncertain of the three, and deliberately so. It does not point at a specific artifact or a measurable geological signature. It points at a shape in human cultural memory that corresponds structurally, if not literally, to the most significant geographical transformation the planet has undergone in the last 500 million years. Not proof, a pattern. And what makes it difficult to simply set aside is that the pattern appears in places and traditions that should, by every conventional account of cultural diffusion, have arrived at entirely different stories, yet somehow did not. That convergence unresolved and not easily dissolved is what the next movements of this evening must now hold alongside the geological and anthropological traces that preceded it to see. What, if anything, the three of them illuminate when placed in the same frame? The first convergence. three traces in the same light. A cartographer working from incomplete data does not abandon the map. She marks the regions she cannot confirm with different notation, a dotted line, instead of a solid one, a notation that reads reported or approximate rather than surveyed. The map remains useful. It remains a genuine representation of knowledge, even where it is also honestly a representation of its own limits. What changes is not the map's function, but the epistemological weight the reader places on each of its features. Some lines are certain, some are provisional. The cartographer's discipline is in knowing which is which and refusing to draw the solid line where only the dotted one is warranted. Tonight we have been building something like that kind of map, 3 traces laid down from 3 different directions, each with its own degree of confidence, each marking its territory with appropriate notation. What the 5th chapter asks is simply this: when the 3 traces are placed in the same light and examined together, does anything emerge that none of them could have produced alone? The first trace established a principle about the geological record that is worth restating, precisely because precision matters here. The record from the Pangean era is not silent because it was never written. It is selectively preserved according to physical and chemical principles that have no relationship whatsoever to the complexity or significance of what once existed on the surfaces now lost. Zircon survives, basalt weathers, subducted crust is unmed. The Central Atlantic magmatic province buried millions of square kilometers of pre-existing surface beneath hundreds of meters of lava. Oceanic crust older than 200 million years has been completely recycled. What this means, stated without embellishment, is that the geological record from the Pangean era could not preserve evidence of a non-extractive, non-monumental, ecologically integrated civilization, even if one had existed, because the preservation mechanisms available in deep time are not sensitive to those categories of evidence. The absence of a signal is not a signal of absence. It is a property of the recording medium. The second trace established something complementary, and in its own way equally important. The biological and cognitive prerequisites for cumulative civilization extended developmental dependence, social knowledge, transmission, ecological management across generations, long-distance coordination through relationship rather than infrastructure do not require any of the materials that deep time preserves. They require neurological complexity, social structure, and time. The Permian world had the time. The Therapsid lineages suggest tentatively that the social and developmental architecture was present in at least nascent form. What the second trace cannot establish is whether those prerequisites were ever fulfilled at the level required for something we would recognize as civilization. It can only establish that the fulfillment was not on biological grounds impossible, and that the evidence we would expect such a civilization to leave, given what we know about non-literate knowledge systems, is precisely the kind of evidence that deep time cannot retain. The third trace arrived from a different direction entirely, and it brought with it the most uncomfortable observation of the 3. Across cultures separated by oceans and by thousands of years of independent development, a structural pattern appears in mythological traditions that describes the present world as a diminished version of a more complete and more connected original state, a world of unity replaced through catastrophe and severance by a world of fragmentation. The specificity of certain oral traditions demonstrated by the Aboriginal Australian coastline research establishes that such traditions can preserve accurate geographic information across timescales extending to 10,000 years and beyond. The convergence of the lost unity motif across traditions with no known contact with one another cannot be fully explained by the standard mechanism of independent invention from shared psychological vulnerability. Because the shared psychology in question, the mourning for a lost connectedness, is not a universal feature of human disaster narratives. It is a specific emotional and structural content that appears consistently in traditions describing not simply catastrophe, but transformation of the world's fundamental geography. What emerges when these 3 traces are placed together is not a conclusion. It is a shape. The geological record cannot preserve what a non-material civilization would leave. A non-material civilization is precisely what the conditions of Pangea would most logically have produced, and the mythological traditions of cultures that have been most thoroughly isolated from one another, most thoroughly subjected to the kind of fragmentation that continental drift produces over tens of millions of years. carry in their most archaic layers a structural memory of something more connected that was lost. Each of these observations taken alone is explicable without reference to the others. Taken together, they describe a space, not a proof, not even a strong inference, but a genuine space in which the possibility of early complex intelligence on a unified world is neither ruled out by the evidence nor supported by it, but simply and honestly unresolved. The detail that makes this convergence more than merely elegant is its directionality. Each trace points the same way without having been designed to do so. Geology points toward the impossibility of detection. Anthropology points toward the possibility of undetectable complexity. Mythology points toward a structural memory of lost unity that appears in the traditions most subjected to the fragmentation geology describes. None of these disciplines was in conversation with the others when it arrived at its contribution to this pattern. The cartographer did not arrange the dotted lines to form a shape. The shape emerged from the separate surveys, and it corresponds in its rough outline to something that the geological history of this planet actually produced: a unified world slowly and irrevocably pulled apart, leaving nothing on its former surfaces that the present world can directly examine. Not proof, a pattern. And a pattern that, unlike most patterns encountered in the study of deep time, does not become less coherent the more carefully it is examined, which is precisely why the next movement of this evening cannot simply accept it, but must instead submit it to the most honest scrutiny available, and see what, if anything, survives the pressure, what the skeptic says, and why it deserves a full hearing. There is a version of this evening's question that a careful scientist would decline to entertain, and the reasons for that declination are worth examining with the same patience we have given to the traces themselves. Science is not at its best a system for confirming interesting ideas. It is a system for subjecting interesting ideas to pressure, for identifying the points at which a hypothesis makes predictions that can be tested, and then testing them honestly, regardless of whether the results are satisfying. By that standard, the question we have been tracing tonight presents genuine and serious difficulties. Not the kind that can be waved away with a phrase about absence of evidence, but the kind that require the question itself to be held more carefully with a clearer accounting of what it can and cannot claim. The skeptic's position here is not a failure of imagination. It is an exercise of exactly the kind of discipline that distinguishes a genuine inquiry from a compelling story told in the dark. The first and most fundamental objection concerns biology, not geology. The cognitive architecture required for cumulative civilization for the kind of knowledge, transmission, social coordination, and ecological management we have been discussing is not a generic property of complex nervous systems. It is a specific product of a specific evolutionary trajectory, one that appears from everything the paleontological record can tell us to have required the particular neurological developments associated with the primate lineage and ultimately with the hominin branch of that lineage. The therapsids of the Permian world, the mammal-like reptiles we briefly examined in the second to trace, were sophisticated animals by the standards of their era, but the gap between their cognitive capacity and the cognitive capacity required for anything resembling civilization is not a small one to gesture across. The neurological structures supporting language, abstract reasoning, and cumulative cultural learning in modern humans are the product of hundreds of millions of years of subsequent evolution that had not yet occurred in the Permian. Acknowledging that the developmental prerequisites for social learning were present in nascent form is not the same as establishing that those prerequisites were anywhere near fulfillment. The distance between the two is the distance between the spark and the fire, and the geological record gives us no evidence that the fire was ever lit. The second objection concerns the unfalsifiability problem, and it is in some respects the most philosophically serious of the three. The argument that a Pangean civilization would have been non-extractive, non-monumental, and ecologically integrated to the point of near invisibility is structurally an argument that insulates itself from disconfirmation. If no evidence survives because the civilization left none by design, and if the geological processes since its disappearance would have erased any evidence it did leave, then the hypothesis is compatible with any conceivable state of the archaeological and geological record, including the state we actually observe, which is total absence of signal. A hypothesis compatible with every possible outcome is not a scientific hypothesis in any meaningful sense. It is a story about the world that cannot be wrong, because it has not specified what wrongness would look like. The philosopher of science Karl Popper identified this property on falsifiability as the defining characteristic of pseudoscience, and the identification was not arbitrary. Knowledge advances by ruling things out, and a claim that cannot be ruled out by any conceivable evidence contributes nothing to the advancement of knowledge, however intellectually appealing it may be as a framework for thinking about deep time. The third objection is directed specifically at the mythological trace, and it draws on a body of comparative folklore research that is genuinely relevant and genuinely inconvenient for the pattern we identified in Chapter 5. The lost unity motif in global mythology, the structural insistence that the present world is the diminished version of a more complete original state, is not as culturally specific as the Chapter 4 presentation may have implied. It is in fact one of the most widely distributed narrative structures in the entire comparative mythology literature, appearing not only in traditions that could plausibly encode geographic memory, but in traditions from landlocked, geologically stable regions, where no physical transformation of the kind we have been discussing ever occurred within any plausible range of human memory. The Hesiodic tradition of declining ages, gold, silver, bronze, heroic iron is a narrative of lost completeness that has nothing to do with coastlines or continental geography. The Buddhist concept of deteriorating cosmic cycles encodes a similar structure in purely metaphysical terms. When a narrative motif is this universally distributed, the most parsimonious explanation is that it reflects something about human psychology, our tendency to idealize the past to locate completeness in what is absent, rather than what is present to construct origin stories that justify current suffering by reference to an earlier state of grace, rather than something about the physical history of the planet. The flood myth convergence is real. The lost unity convergence is also real. Neither necessarily encodes geological memory. Both are entirely consistent with being products of the human mind operating on its own interior landscape. These three objections deserve the weight they carry. They are not easily dismissed, and they should not be. What they do taken together is set a necessary boundary around what the evening's tracers can honestly claim they cannot establish that early complex intelligence existed on Pangea, and the question of whether it did remains by any rigorous scientific standard not merely unanswered, but very possibly unanswerable. And yet, and this is not a rhetorical pivot, but an honest accounting of what remains, the objections do not dissolve the pattern. They constrain it. They clarify what it cannot claim. They do not explain why the geological record's erasure is so precisely calibrated to the category of evidence that non-material intelligence would produce. They do not account for why the biological prerequisites for cumulative learning appear in Permian lineages at all, if the subsequent evolutionary trajectory that fulfilled them is the only one that could have done so. And they do not fully explain why the oral traditions with the most demonstrably accurate geographic memory, those closest to the physical transformations of coastline and landscape, are also those whose lost unity narratives carry the most specific geographic content, rather than the most abstract metaphysical content. The skeptic has spoken clearly and fairly. The pattern reduced but not eliminated remains open, and it is into that remaining openness that the next trace must now carefully move. Recovery. What remains after the pressure? There is a particular kind of intellectual honesty that looks from the outside like retreat, but is actually something closer to consolidation. When a serious objection is raised against a line of inquiry, when the unfalsifiability problem is named, when the biological gaps are measured precisely, when the psychological explanation for mythological convergence is laid out with the care it deserves, the honest response is not to argue around the objection, but to absorb it fully, to let it do its work, and then to examine what the inquiry looks like afterward. Not what it looked like before the pressure was applied, but after. What remains when the parts that cannot survive scrutiny have been removed is not necessarily nothing. Sometimes it is something smaller and more defensible than what preceded it, a question stripped of its overreach, a pattern clarified by the removal of its weakest supports, an observation that the skeptic's tools applied with maximum force still could not fully dissolve. What remains after Chapter 6 is worth naming carefully. The biological objection is established that no Permian therapsid was demonstrably on a cognitive trajectory towards civilization, and that the neurological distance between what the fossil record shows and what civilization requires is genuinely vast. This is a well-taken point, and it forecloses a specific version of the question, the version in which a Permian therapsid society built something resembling a human civilization during the late Pangean period. That version was always the weakest formulation of the inquiry, and its removal is not a loss. What the biological objection cannot foreclose is the broader question, which was never specifically about therapsids. The Pangean era spans approximately 100 million years. The therapsids are one lineage documented by a fossil record that paleontologists routinely describe as incomplete at the species level, and almost certainly more incomplete at the behavioral and neurological level. The cognitive capacity of Permian fauna is not fully known. It is inferred from skeletal proxies that carry real but limited information about the nervous systems they once housed. The objection narrows the question appropriately. It does not close it. The unfalsifiability objection is the most serious of the three, and its partial answer requires a distinction that philosophy of science has been working through since Popper's original formulation: strict falsifiability. The requirement that a hypothesis specify conditions under which it would be proven wrong is a powerful and valuable criterion for evaluating scientific hypotheses that operate within domains where controlled testing is possible. It is a less straightforwardly applicable criterion for hypotheses about singular historical events that occurred under conditions of extreme evidential degradation. The question of whether complex intelligence existed on Pangea is in its logical structure more similar to certain questions in cosmology and deep paleontology than to questions in experimental physics. It concerns a unique past state of a complex system, accessible only through indirect proxies, none of which were designed to record the specific phenomenon in question. Cosmologists routinely work with hypotheses about the early universe that cannot be directly tested and that carry significant unfalsifiability concerns. Deep paleontologists reconstruct behavioral complexity in extinct lineages from skeletal evidence that cannot by its nature settle the question definitively. The unfalsifiability objection does not eliminate the inquiry. It categorizes it correctly as a question at the boundary of what systematic knowledge can reach, requiring intellectual humility, rather than either confident assertion or confident dismissal. What the mythological objection left intact is also worth recovering with precision. The objection correctly pointed out that the lost unity narrative structure appears in traditions with no plausible relationship to geographic memory, which means the structure alone cannot be treated as evidence of anything beyond human psychological tendency. This is entirely correct. What it leaves unaddressed is the specific subgroup of traditions, those documented in the manner of the Aboriginal Australian coastline research, to carry accurate geographic information about physically transformed landscapes in which the lost unity content is not purely metaphysical but specifically geographic. The Polynesian traditions that name Hawaii as a sunken homeland correspond to regions of the Pacific where sea level rise has indeed submerged low-lying land over the post-glacial period. Certain Mesopotamian flood traditions describe not a universal psychological catastrophe, but a specific inundation of a specific low-lying region, the Persian Gulf Basin, which was dry land during the last glacial maximum, and flooded over several thousand years as sea levels rose. The psychological explanation accounts for the universal distribution of the structure. It accounts less cleanly for the geographic specificity of the traditions with the most demonstrably accurate memory. Both things can be true simultaneously. The structure is psychologically universal, and the specific content in specific traditions may encode real geographic memory. The objection and the trace are not mutually exclusive. They divide the phenomenon between them. What the recovery from the skeptic chapter ultimately produces is a question that has been made more honest by the pressure applied to it. The inquiry can no longer claim, if it ever honestly could, that the traces constitute evidence of a lost Pangean civilization. What they constitute after the skeptic's work is done is a set of observations that together describe the precise conditions under which such a civilization would be undetectable conditions that correspond with uncomfortable accuracy to the actual geological, biological, and cultural history of this planet. The geological record is arranged in exactly the categories of evidence that a non-material civilization would produce. The biological prerequisites for cumulative intelligence appear in Pangean lineages at a level sufficient to make the question non-trivial. The oral traditions with the most accurate geographic memory are those most subjected to the physical fragmentation that continental drift produces. These are not proofs. They are not even strong inferences. They are the residue of the inquiry after its weakest claims have been removed, and that residue, small as it is and honest about its own limits, is genuinely interesting in a way that neither confident assertion nor confident dismissal can quite account for. The question that the recovery leaves open is not whether we can know. We cannot know, and that boundary is real and should be respected. The question it leaves open is whether the conditions of the Pangean world, the vast continuous land, the 100 million years of biological experimentation, the slow dissolution that erased every surface, constitute a space in which intelligence might have organized itself in ways we have not yet learned to look for. That space does not require filling with certainty. It requires only being held carefully as we turn now toward the material it opens into, which is not more evidence, but something richer and more difficult, the question of what intelligence looks like when the world it inhabits is actively, irreversibly coming apart. What intelligence does when the world comes apart. The city of Ubar, called the Atlantis of the Sands, in some accounts, though, that comparison flatters both and clarifies. Neither existed in the Rub al-Khali desert of the Arabian Peninsula for several centuries before disappearing so completely that its location was disputed for nearly a millennium. It was not buried by volcanic activity or subducted into the mantle. It collapsed into a limestone cavern beneath it, swallowed by the same underground void system that its inhabitants had been drawing water from for generations. The water table dropped, the cavern roof weakened, the city fell into its own foundation, and the desert covered what remained within decades. When NASA satellite imagery finally located the site in 1992, the traces were visible only because the compacted caravan routes converging on the location had left subtle differences in sand density detectable from orbit. The city itself had left almost nothing. The roads that led to it had left slightly more because roads, unlike buildings, distribute their evidence across a landscape rather than concentrating it in a single vulnerable point. What Ubar demonstrates at a scale comprehensible to human intuition, rather than requiring the abstraction of geological time, is that civilizations do not always disappear dramatically. Sometimes they disappear into the very resource systems that sustain them, and what outlasts the civilization is not its center, but the faint traces of movement toward it. This chapter is concerned with movement, specifically with what happens to intelligence, to knowledge systems, and to the organizational complexity we associate with civilization when the landscape those systems depend on begins to shift beneath them. The recovery chapter established that the inquiry after skeptical pressure resolves into a question about what intelligence looks like when the world it inhabits is coming apart. That question has a partial answer available from sources closer to our own experience than the Permian fossil record, and the answer is more specific and more instructive than the general principle that fragmentation produces loss. It is this intelligence under conditions of geographic dissolution does not decline uniformly. It differentiates. Some capacities sharpen precisely because the conditions that once made them unnecessary have disappeared. Others attenuate for the same reason. The civilization that emerges from a dissolving world is not a smaller version of the civilization that preceded the dissolution. It is a different kind of thing optimized for different problems, carrying different knowledge, and invisible by different mechanisms than the one it replaced. The human colonization of the Pacific offers the most directly relevant case study available within the timescales that human evidence can illuminate. Between approximately 3,500 and 1,000 years ago, Polynesian navigators crossed the largest ocean on the planet in double-hulled canoes, settling islands separated by thousands of kilometers of open water with a navigational accuracy that Western maritime technology would not reliably match until the development of the chronometer in the 18th century. They did this without instruments in the sense we typically mean, without compasses, sextants, or written charts. What they used instead was an extraordinarily sophisticated observational system, encoding the behavior of stars, ocean swells, wind patterns, bird flight, paths, cloud formations over unseen islands, and the bioluminescence patterns of specific deep water currents. This knowledge was not written down. It was transmitted through training systems that embedded navigational information in the body, in the ability to feel swell direction through the hull of a canoe, while sleeping in the capacity to read star positions as a continuous dynamic system rather than a static map. The knowledge was real, precise, and effective enough to settle every habitable island in the Pacific. It left almost no material trace, and it emerged specifically in response to the challenge of crossing water, of navigating a world where the land connections that had previously enabled overland movement had been replaced by open ocean. The Polynesian case is not an analogy for Pangean dissolution in any literal sense. The timescales are incomparable. The biological actors are entirely different, and the specific navigational challenges of open ocean Pacific crossing are not transferable to a supercontinent interior. What it is more carefully stated is a demonstration of a principle that geographic fragmentation does not simply reduce the capabilities of the intelligent systems it affects. It selects among them, eliminating those calibrated to conditions that no longer exist, and accelerating the development of those suited to the new geography. The intelligence that navigated the Pacific was not less sophisticated than the intelligence of the continental Asian societies from which Polynesian ancestors ultimately derived. It was differently sophisticated, optimized for a world of water gaps, rather than land corridors carrying knowledge that continental civilizations never needed to develop and therefore never did. Apply that principle to the dissolution of Pangea, and the implication is not that any intelligence present during the breakup would have simply declined as connectivity decreased. It is that such intelligence would have differentiated along the lines of the fragmentation itself, developing in regions where new coastlines were forming, and new water gaps were opening, capacities suited to navigating those transitions, while losing gradually, and without conscious decision, the capacities that had served a more connected world. The knowledge systems of a dissolving Pangea would not look like the knowledge systems of an intact Pangea, any more than Polynesian navigation looks like Silk Road trade network management. They would be responding to different geographic problems organized around different resources, and transmissible only within the communities that shared the specific environmental context that made them meaningful. As the fragmentation deepened and communities became more isolated, those differentiated knowledge systems would diverge further, not toward greater complexity in any universal sense, but toward greater specificity, greater calibration to local conditions, and greater dependence on the continuity of the specific human chains transmitting them. Break the chain and the knowledge does not transfer to the geological record, it simply stops. What this expansion adds to the map we have been building is a temporal texture that the earlier traces did not fully articulate. The dissolution of Pangea was not a single event producing a single response. It was a process extending across tens of millions of years, producing successive waves of geographic challenge and adaptive response, each wave selecting for different capacities and eliminating others, each producing knowledge systems more locally calibrated and less globally transmissible than the ones preceding them. By the time the fragmentation was complete, whatever intelligence had navigated, its early stages would have been in any meaningful sense gone, not destroyed but differentiated into forms so locally specific and so dependent on the chains of transmission that the breaking of those chains which the fragmentation itself guaranteed left nothing that the subsequent world could receive. And it is in that specific moment of breaking in the texture of what happens at the point where a knowledge chain snaps that the 9th chapter finds the detail it has been moving toward all evening, the detail in the boundary layer. At the precise geological boundary between the Permian and Triassic periods, the thin line in the rock record marking the largest mass extinction in Earth's history, there is a carbon isotope anomaly so large, so rapid, and so chemically specific that it has generated more scientific literature than almost any other single stratigraphic feature in the geological record, and it remains after decades of sustained investigation by some of the most rigorous geochemists working in deep time, not fully explained. The anomaly is a sudden massive negative excursion in the ratio of carbon, 13 to carbon 12 in marine carbonates and organic matter deposited at that boundary, a shift so large that it requires by the mass balance calculations used to model it, an injection of isotopically light carbon into the ocean atmosphere system, at a rate and volume that the most widely accepted causal mechanism the Siberian Traps volcanic province struggles to fully account for. The numbers are not subtly wrong. In some models, the gap between the carbon that the Siberian Traps can demonstrably have produced and the carbon required to explain the isotopic signature runs to tens of thousands of gigatons. The discrepancy is acknowledged in the primary literature, it has not been closed. To understand why this matters beyond the narrow concerns of isotope geochemistry, it helps to understand what a carbon isotope excursion of this magnitude actually represents in physical terms. Carbon-12 and carbon-13 are both stable isotopes of carbon, present in slightly different proportions in different reservoirs of space. The atmosphere, the ocean, living organic matter, carbonate rock and fossil organic carbon all carry characteristic isotopic signatures that reflect the biological and chemical processes that produce them. Biological processes, including photosynthesis, preferentially incorporate carbon-12, which means that organic matter, living tissue, soil, carbon coal oil is depleted in carbon-13 relative to inorganic carbonate. When a large pulse of biologically derived or thermally altered organic carbon enters the atmosphere or ocean rapidly, it drives the isotopic ratio of the entire system toward lighter values, producing exactly the kind of negative excursion recorded at the Permian-Triassic boundary. The Siberian traps produce such a pulse both through direct volcanic outgassing and through the thermal alteration of coal and organic rich sediments the lavas intruded into. What the models have consistently found is that the pulse, as currently reconstructed from the volcanic record, may not be large enough or rapid enough or isotopically light enough to fully account for the excursion's magnitude and speed in every formation where it has been measured. The proposed supplementary mechanisms are real and scientifically serious. Methane. Clathrate destabilization. The rapid release of methane stored in ice, like structures on continental shelves and in permafrost, triggered by the initial warming from Siberian trap outgassing, would inject large volumes of extremely light carbon into the system, quickly potentially closing the mass balance gap. Ocean anoxia spreading through oxygen-depleted deep waters as marine ecosystems collapsed could have altered the carbon cycle in ways that amplified the isotopic signal beyond what the volcanic input alone would predict. These mechanisms are not speculative. They are grounded in well-understood chemistry and supported by independent lines of evidence. What they share is a dependence on feedback processes on the Siberian trap, warming triggering secondary releases that triggered tertiary effects, which means that the full carbon budget of the Permian-Triassic event is a reconstruction of an entire Earth system response, not a simple accounting of a single input. And reconstructions of entire Earth system responses applied to events 252 million years in the past carry uncertainties that the most careful researchers are honest about preserving in their models. What follows the boundary in the rock record is in its own way as strange as the boundary itself. For approximately 10 million years after the Permian-Triassic extinction, a period spanning from roughly 252 to 240 million years ago, the geological record shows an almost complete absence of coal formation anywhere on Earth. Geologists call this the coal gap, and its explanation is straightforward in outline. The forests that produced the organic debris from which coal eventually forms were devastated by the extinction event, and the recovery of complex forest ecosystems took far longer than the recovery of most other biological systems. What is not straightforward is the duration. 10 million years is an extraordinarily long recovery time for vegetation. Other major extinction events in Earth's history produced coal gaps measured in hundreds of thousands of years, not tens of millions. The Permian-Triassic coal gap is anomalously long by a factor that has not been fully accounted for by any single mechanism, and the most recent research into the delayed recovery of Triassic forest ecosystems continues to produce competing hypotheses without convergence on a consensus explanation. These two details the carbon isotope excursion that the Siberian traps cannot fully account for, and the coal gap that outlasted every comparable ecological disruption in the record site at the exact boundary, marking the end of the most complex biosphere the Pangean world had produced. They do not point toward a lost civilization, they point toward a physical event at the threshold of Pangea's dissolution that the planet's own chemistry recorded as something larger and stranger than the best understood mechanism can cleanly explain. The record kept these details with the same fidelity with which it keeps everything else in isotope ratios, in the presence and absence of specific mineral phases, in the thickness and composition of boundary clay layers measured in millimeters across outcrops on 5 continents. It kept them not because they were significant in any intentional sense, but because the chemistry happened and the chemistry was preserved. and the chemistry examined honestly and without overreach describes a world and ending in a way that current models approach but do not fully enclose. This is the highest point of the evening's inquiry, and it is worth being precise about what makes it the highest. It is not the most dramatic claim. It is the most grounded one, the point at which the question we had been tracing connects to something in the actual geological record that professional scientists, using the most rigorous methods available, have documented, modelled, and not fully resolved. The pattern is not proof of anything beyond the boundary's own complexity, but it is real. It is specific, it is measured in the rock on 5 continents, and the number that the models cannot close does not become smaller the more carefully it is examined. What comes next after a peak this specific and this grounded is not more evidence. It is the longer view, the step back from the boundary layer to the full landscape of everything the evening has assembled, seen now not as separate traces, but as a single if unresolved picture. The view from a distance all traces as one landscape. There is a practice in geology called regional mapping, distinct from the close examination of individual outcrops or formations, in which a geologist steps back from the specific and attempts to read the landscape at a scale where individual features lose their particularity and patterns become visible that no single measurement could reveal. A fold that looks at the outcrop level, like a local deformation, becomes at the regional scale part of a system of folds extending across hundreds of kilometers, indicating a compression event of continental significance. A chemical anomaly that looks in a single core sample like a local diagenetic artifact becomes, when correlated across dozens of sites on multiple continents, a global event recorded simultaneously in every marine basin that existed at that moment in Earth's history. The practice of stepping back does not abandon the detail. It reframes it, places it within a context large enough to reveal what the detail examined alone could not show. What this chapter attempts is something analogous, a regional map of everything the evening has assembled, drawn from a distance sufficient to see its shape as a whole, rather than as a sequence of individual traces. The geological trace established that the Pangean era is represented in the current rock record through a series of filters so selective and so systematically biased against surface complexity that the absence of any particular category of evidence cannot be interpreted as confirmation of its historical absence. The zircon survives. The basalt weathers. The subducted crust is unmade. The Central Atlantic magmatic province buried the initial rift surfaces under hundreds of meters of lava. The Panthalastic seafloor was completely recycled. What this means at the regional scale is not merely that evidence is missing. It means that the recording medium was constitutionally incapable of preserving the specific categories of evidence that would matter most for the question we are tracing. This is a statement about the medium, not about what the medium once held. A civilization that built nothing permanent, extracted nothing at geological scale, and transmitted its knowledge through people rather than objects, would produce a signature in the Pangean record that is, as far as we can currently determine, indistinguishable from a signature of total absence. The geological trace viewed from a distance resolves into a single observation the record cannot confirm and cannot deny, and that limitation is structural rather than contingent. The anthropological trace established that the cognitive and social prerequisites for cumulative civilization extended: developmental dependence knowledge, transmission across generations, ecological management at landscape scale, long-distance coordination through relationship networks do not require any of the materials that deep time preserves and appear in biological lineages that predate the cognitive revolution that produced them in our own species. The Yolngu navigational traditions that preserved accurate coastal geography across 10,000 years of sea level rise, the Polynesian wayfinding systems that settled the Pacific without instruments, the documented pharmacological and ecological knowledge of non-literate societies that left no material trace of their sophistication. These are not analogies for a Pangean civilization. They are demonstrations that the category of non-material civilization is not hypothetical. It exists, it has existed, and it leaves exactly the kind of evidence that the geological trace describes as unpreservable. Viewed from a distance, the anthropological trace and the geological trace resolve into the same shape from opposite directions. One describes what the medium cannot hold, the other describes civilizations that produce precisely that kind of content. The mythological trace arrive from the furthest remove and with the most uncertainty attached, and the skeptic chapter appropriately reduced it to its most defensible form. What survives that reduction at the regional scale is narrower than what Chapter 4 presented, but more carefully bounded. The oral traditions with the most demonstrably accurate geographic memory. Those closest in their cultural context to the physical transformations of coastline and landscape carry lost unity content that is geographic rather than purely metaphysical in character. The psychological explanation for the universal distribution of the lost unity structure is fully adequate for the universal distribution. It is less adequate for the specific geographic content of the specific traditions that correspond most closely to regions of documented physical transformation. That residue is not evidence of a Pangean civilization. It is evidence that cultural memory of geographic change can persist across timescales long enough to make the question of its upper limit genuinely open, and that the traditions encoding the most geographically specific content tend to be those arising from populations most directly subjected to the kind of fragmentation that continental drift produces at all scales. Viewed from a distance, the mythological trace resolves into a demonstration that geographic transformation leaves cultural marks that outlast the geography itself, which is in its essential structure exactly what the geological and anthropological traces would predict. What the regional view reveals when these three traces are placed in the same frame and examined at sufficient distance is that they do not simply point in the same direction. They describe the same phenomenon from three different disciplinary positions. Geology describes it as the mechanism of erasure. Anthropology describes it as the category of thing most susceptible to that erasure. Mythology describes it as what persists in altered form in the cultural systems that survive the erasure as consequences. The three descriptions are not redundant. Each adds a dimension the others cannot provide. But they converge on a common object, the space defined by what was possible, what was unpreservable, and what might nonetheless have echoed forward with a consistency that the regional view makes visible in a way that the individual trace examination could not. The Permian-Triassic boundary layer, which Chapter 9 examined as the highest and most grounded point of the evening's inquiry, fits within this regional view as the geological punctuation mark at the end of Pangea's most complex biological chapter. The carbon isotope excursion whose magnitude the Siberian traps cannot fully account for, and the coal gap whose duration exceeds every comparable recovery period in the record are not evidence of anything beyond their own complexity, but they are at the regional scale part of the same picture, a world at the threshold of dissolution ending in a way that the best available models approach from one direction and have not yet fully enclosed. They add to the regional map not a new trace but a specific texture. The measurement of how much the boundary between one world and the next resists clean explanation, even when the tools applied to it are as precise and as honestly used as the current state of geochemistry permits. The landscape that emerges from this distance is not a proof, and it would be a failure of everything the evening has attempted to describe it as one. It is more honestly a coherent space, a region of genuine uncertainty bounded on all sides by what the available disciplines can confirm and define in its interior, by what those disciplines applied with maximum rigour have not been able to rule out. The question of whether intelligence organised itself in some form on the unified world of Pangea remains after everything assembled in this frame genuinely and honestly open. Not open because the evidence has been ignored or the objections have been avoided, but open because the conditions that produce the question are the same conditions that make the question unanswerable by the methods currently available to us. That is not a comfortable conclusion. It is, however, an accurate one, and accuracy in a question this old and this large is worth more than comfort. What remains, having seen the landscape whole, is the question of what to do with that openness, not analytically, but in the quieter register that the evening is now moving toward. What the question becomes when it stops being a question. There is a point in any sustained inquiry at which the object of investigation quietly changes character, not because the inquiry has failed, but because it has gone far enough to reveal what kind of thing the object actually is. What begins as a historical question amenable in principle to the methods of history, the accumulation of evidence, the testing of hypotheses, the gradual narrowing of uncertainty through disciplined investigation can, when pursued honestly to its boundary conditions, reveal itself to be something older and less tractable than history. Not a question that has not yet been answered, but a question that is structured in such a way that the category of answer it would require does not correspond to any category of evidence the world has preserved. At that boundary, the inquiry does not end. It transforms. The tools change. The register changes. What was archaeology becomes by necessity rather than by preference something that sits between philosophy and the older human practice of simply remaining with what cannot be resolved. The question we have been carrying all evening, whether intelligence organized itself in some form on the unified world of Pangea, and whether the dissolution of that world erased not just the physical traces of that intelligence, but the very possibility of our knowing it existed, is that kind of question. It arrived as a historical inquiry and has, through the process of honest examination, revealed itself to be something more fundamental. It is a question about the relationship between the timescales on which intelligence operates and the timescales on which the planet operates, and what happens when those two timescales are so radically mismatched that the longer one does not merely outlast the shorter, but actively, systematically and completely dismantles every medium through which the shorter one might have left a record. That is not a question that geology can answer. It is not a question that anthropology can answer. It is a question about the nature of knowing itself, about what it means to say that something happened when the conditions that would allow us to establish its having happened are precisely the conditions that the event in question foreclosed. The philosopher Simone Weil wrote in a different context entirely that attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity, that to attend to something fully without seeking to use it or resolve it, or transform it into something more manageable, is among the most difficult and most valuable things a mind can do. The observation translates unexpectedly but genuinely to the space this evening has been building toward. The honest response to the question of Pangea's possible intelligence is not to fill the uncertainty with confident assertion, or to evacuate it with confident dismissal. It is to attend to it to hold the full shape of what is known and what is not, to resist both the comfort of resolution and the comfort of declared impossibility, and to remain with the observation that the planet on which we exist has a history so much longer and so much more thoroughly erased than our intuitions are equipped to protest that the boundary of our knowledge is not, in this case, a boundary we are likely to push through. It is the permanent edge of what the world by its own physical nature permits us to know about itself. This is where archaeology becomes philosophy, and where philosophy taken seriously enough begins to open into something that has historically been called cosmological, a concern not merely with what happened on this planet in a particular geological period, but with the structure of time and knowledge and material existence as they relate to the possibility of intelligence persisting in a universe that is indifferent to persistence. The Pangean world is gone, not diminished, not fragmentary, not partially recoverable. Gone, returned to the mantle and redistributed across the current surface of the planet in forms that carry no readable record of what they once were part of. The intelligence that may or may not have organized itself within that world is either gone in the same absolute sense or persists in forms so altered by 200 million years of dissolution and differentiation that the connection to its origin is beyond any reconstruction available to us. In either case, what we are left with is the fact of the planet's indifference, its complete incapacity, not its unwillingness, but its structural incapacity to preserve the kind of record that would allow the question to be settled. And yet the question persists. It persists not because we lack the information to dismiss it, but because the conditions of its persistence are themselves informative about something real. We are a species that evolved on a planet or Hawaii, fragmented, already broken into separate continents, already carrying in its geology the consequences of a dissolution. We arrived too late to witness. Our sense of the world as divided as consisting of separate land masses, separated by impassable water, as being organized into distinct regions with distinct biologies and distinct histories, all of that is a perception shaped by our arrival at a particular moment in the planet's ongoing reorganization. We did not inherit a whole world. We inherited a world already in the middle of coming apart, and we built our entire framework for understanding time and place in history within that condition of fragmentation, assuming it was the natural state rather than a phase. The question of Pangea asks very quietly what we might think differently if we understood the wholeness as the baseline and the fragmentation as the event. We will not resolve this tonight. That is not what this space is for. What this space is for in these final movements is the older and more honest practice of sitting with a question that has genuinely resisted resolution, not because the inquiry was insufficient, but because the question is genuinely at the edge of what the human relationship with deep time permits us to know. The planet is 4.5 billion years old. Our species is 300,000 years old. The civilization that produced the instruments with which we have been examining the Pangean record is perhaps 10,000 years old in its earliest recognizable forms. The ratio of what we can examine to what has already occurred, of the slice of deep time accessible to human investigation to the full depth of planetary history, is not a ratio that justifies confidence about what has or has not been lost. It justifies instead a particular quality of attention-wide, unhurried, honest about its limits and willing to remain with what it cannot resolve. The next and final movement does not attempt resolution. It offers instead a single physical image, one concrete detail held quietly, as the place where the evening comes to rest. The grain of zircon, in a laboratory drawer somewhere into the collections of a university geology department. The specific institution is less important than the fact of its ordinariness. The fact that this is not a museum display or a celebrated specimen, but simply a working sample in a working collection. There is a grain of zircon no larger than a grain of sand. It was extracted from a metamorphic rock formation separated from the surrounding mineral matrix by a process of density sorting mounted in epoxy resin and polished to a surface smooth enough to accept the focused beam of an ion microprobe. The measure of Pfund taken from it returned an age of several 100 million years. The grain has been sitting in that drawer or one like it since the analysis was completed. It is not remarkable by the standards of its field. Zircon grains of comparable age are measured in geology laboratories on every continent. What is remarkable, what becomes remarkable only when held in the context of everything this evening has assembled, is what the grain has been through and what it has kept. That grain of zircon crystallized in a magma body that cooled somewhere within the crust of Pangea. It survived the tectonic events that deformed the surrounding rock, surviving temperatures and pressures that recrystallized everything around it into new mineral assemblages, while it held its original crystal structure intact. It survived the erosion that eventually exposed the formation at the surface, the transport by water or wind that moved it from its original location, the deposition in a new sedimentary context, the subsequent burial and metamorphism of that context, and the eventual re-exposure by another cycle of erosion millions of years later. It survived subcontinent scale, geological events folding, faulting the opening of ocean basins, the collision of plates that would have been to anything living on the surface above it incomprehensible in their scale and invisible in their duration. And through all of it, in the uranium and lead isotopes locked within its crystal lattice, it preserved a precise chemical record of the moment it formed. Not a record of what surrounded it, not a record of the surface above it, only of itself and of the heat and pressure of its own birth. This is what the planet keeps. Not the complexity of what lived on its surface, not the knowledge carried in the minds of whatever organisms navigated its landscapes, not the social structures or ecological relationships or oral traditions that may or may not have accumulated across the 100 million years of Pangea's intact existence. It keeps the chemistry of individual mineral grains, the isotopic signatures of boundary events, the structural deformation patterns of rock that was once deep in the crust and is now exposed at the surface by processes that took tens of millions of years to complete. It keeps consequences without context, chemistry, without narrative pressure, without purpose. And it keeps these things not because they were important, not because they were selected for preservation by any process sensitive to significance, but simply because the physics of crystal structure is more durable than almost everything else the planet produces. The grain of zircon in that laboratory drawer is, in a sense that is not metaphorical but strictly physical, a contemporary of whatever existed on the surface of Pangea. It was there, not on the surface, not witnessing anything but present within the crust of the same world during the entire span of time this evening has been examining. If the Permian world produced anything that could be called complex intelligence, the zircon grain was crystallizing in the magma below it while it did. If any knowledge was transmitted across that world, any ecological understanding accumulated, any navigational system developed for a landscape that no longer exists in any form on this planet, the zircon grain was already old. When it happened already carrying its record of an earlier heat, already indifferent to everything occurring above it, and when whatever may have existed on that surface was gone, whether gradually through fragmentation and dissolution, or abruptly through the Permian-Triassic extinction, or through processes we have not named tonight, because we do not have the evidence to name them, the grain continued. Unchanged. Carrying only what it had always carried, which was never a record of the surface at all. There is a particular quality of stillness that comes from holding this image without trying to extract more from it than it contains. The grain is not a symbol, it is not a metaphor for memory, or for survival, or for the indifference of geological time, though it could serve as all of those things without distortion. It is simply a mineral grain sitting in a drawer, its isotopic ratios already measured and recorded in a database entry that will itself eventually be lost. It does not know that it survived. It does not carry the weight of what it outlasted. It is simply what the planet kept from a world that produced it when everything else was returned. And the question of what else that world produced, what organized itself within the 100 million years of Pangea's continuity, what knowledge accumulated, and what patterns were traced across the vast unbroken land, what was lost when the land began its slow and irrevocable coming apart, that question remains exactly where it has been all evening. Not answered, not dismissible, not resolved into either confirmation or denial. Simply open the way deep time is open, vast, honest, and larger than any answer we are currently equipped to give it. Not proof, a pattern, and the pattern, like the grain, simply remains. Rest now. Now, traveller, the oldest ocean floor on Earth is less than 200 million years old. We began there with that single fact held lightly in the dark. It seemed at the start of the evening like a piece of data, a measurement, a number from a database of planetary ages. But a number changes when you spend time with it. It deepens. The ocean floor that does not exist because it has already been returned. That absence is not empty. It is the shape of everything the planet processed back into itself before we arrived to ask what had been there. We end where we began looking at the same measurement, and it is larger now than it was. Not more frightening, just larger. The way a room looks larger once you understand how old the house is. There is a particular kind of peace that comes not from having understood something, but from having fully accepted that understanding was never the destination. We followed 3 traces tonight through stone, through the logic of unrecorded knowledge, through the mythological shapes of lost connection, and we arrived honestly and without detour at a boundary. The traces themselves defined the place where the available methods reach their limit, and the question continues past them into a silence that is not the silence of an answer withheld, but the silence of a world that was completed and returned before any instrument existed to measure it. That boundary is real. It is not a failure of inquiry. It is the honest shape of what deep time permits us to know, and there is something quietly settling about a limit that has been reached honestly rather than avoided. The history of this planet is not, it turns out, a record waiting to be read. It is a series of drafts, most of which were revised beyond recognition before anyone arrived to read the previous version. What we have access to is the current draft, the one written over the top of everything that came before, incorporating some of its chemistry but none of its narrative. We read it and feel sometimes that something is missing from the beginning, that the opening pages were torn out, and that what remains starts too abruptly, too recently, with too little explanation for how the world came to be configured as it is. That feeling is not delusion. It is a reasonable response to a genuine absence. What the planet kept does not fully account for what the planet held. Perhaps that is enough to carry into sleep not an answer, but an honest accounting of the question's shape. A world that was once whole, a dissolution so slow it was indistinguishable from permanence to anything living through it. A grain of zircon still in a laboratory drawer carrying only its own birth and nothing of the surface above it. These are the things the evening leaves behind, and they do not require resolution to rest alongside. Some of the most inhabitable spaces in the mind are the ones that hold a question, without pressing it toward a conclusion, that let the uncertainty settle like sediment layer by gentle layer, until the water above it is clear. One last thing very soft before the silence. If the planet has done this before, if the conditions for intelligence are recurrent rather than singular, if complexity arises when the circumstances allow and dissolves when they change, And if what we experience as civilization is one iteration of a process the Earth has been running longer than our deepest history can reach, then what we are tonight is not the beginning of the story. We are somewhere inside it, and that is in its own way a remarkable place to be. Let the weight of the day release now, and the weight of deep time with it. The questions that outlast us are not ours to carry through the night. The planet will continue its slow reorganization without requiring our attention, the Atlantic still widening by the width of a fingernail. Each year, the Himalayas still rising by the height of a grain of sand each day, the whole vast machinery of the Earth proceeding at its own pace, indifferent to our waking and our sleeping alike. You are resting on a surface that is temporary and ancient at once, and both of those things are true without contradiction, and neither of them requires anything from you right now, except to let the breath slow and the body settle and the mind release whatever it has been holding. Rest now, traveller. The stone will keep what it keeps. The rest was never lost. It was only returned to a place deeper than memory reaches, and it is resting there too in the dark below the dark quiet as a mineral grain in the slow heat of the world.